So welcome everybody. My name is Samia Rahman and I am the director of the Muslim Institute, a fellowship organisation that encourages critical thinking. Today's webinar is celebrating the launch of Professor Iftikhar H.Malik's excellent book, The Silk Road and Beyond, Narratives of a Muslim Historian, which was recently released under the auspices of Oxford University Press. This 368-page study captures lived realities across the region and initiates readers into encountering Muslim heritage across the four continents where cultures share commonalities beyond the narrowly defined premise of conflicts. Professor Malik, to introduce him, is Professor of History at Bath Spa University, NCR at Wolfson, and a Muslim Institute Fellow. He's joined today to talk about his book by Leyla Jagiella. Leyla, do you want to say hi? She is a cultural anthropologist exploring orthodoxy and heterodoxy in South Asian Islam. And she also edited the relics issue of the Muslim Institute publication, Critical Muslim. We're also joined by Dr. Elizabeth Peretz of the University of Oxford. Elizabeth is a historian, mainly of UK 20th century health and welfare policy and practice. And she's currently working on an episode in the history of her own family in the late 18th century. We are also due to be joined by Dr. Osama Siddique, but I don't believe he's made it yet. Arslan, do we have any sign of Dr.
Not as yet. He seems to be running a few minutes late.
A bit late. Okay, no problem. So I'll introduce. Well, he researches, teaches, and writes in the areas of legal history, constitutional law, legal sociology, and human rights. He also advises on the justice sector, the rule of law, and regulatory reforms. He writes historical fiction. Iftikhar was just telling us about a novel he's working on, and he likes to travel. He's based in Lahore. So Iftikhar, if I could begin this session by asking you to tell us a little bit about the book. I think you have a hard copy that you can share us, maybe?
Okay. Here's the book. Well, first of all, my thanks to the Muslim Institute for convening this webinar meeting. The Muslim Institute has been there for about 10 or 12 years. They publish Critical Muslim, which is a journal, and also we organize annual winter gathering at Salisbury, one of the old style colleges in this country called Sarum College. And we invite people from different walks of life, not just Muslims, atheists, non-Christians, Jews, Hindus, to talk about all kinds of issues. So I'm glad that they are sponsoring this event, and I'm really thankful to all of you, and especially my friends, my fellow panelists from Germany and from Britain, and I'm sure Dr. Osama Siddique will be able to join us soon. And then I know there are friends and audience here from Russia, from India, Pakistan, and different parts of the world. I'm a historian, so naturally I'm very history-minded, and I do lots of work in the libraries here in Oxford, London, wherever I go. But I also feel that other than archival work, I should go and see the societies, the places, the landscape, the humanscape as they exist wherever I go. And this is where I started thinking of, writing these chapters. And I didn't want to write them in a very typical, dry, academic, historical way. I wanted to make them, sort of into easy reads. And that is how all these chapters at different times over the last 30, 40 years got together. So if you get a chance to read it, you will see that the early section is very personal. It talks about, for example, this village where my older sister opened the first ever school for girls, and how she was able to convince, the seniors in that community to send their daughters or their granddaughters to that school. And I was witness as a little kid to those efforts. And when I read about Taliban and Boko Haram and all that, I can see how some people were resistant to the idea of girls' education, say 40, 50 years ago. But, and then I talk about some of my own teachers and in America and elsewhere. And in between, I bring in something very traditional, which I remembered quite a bit when I was visiting Delhi, the old Delhi, and where the famous, poet Mirza Ghalib lived, and across from his house, Hakim Ajmal Khan's Dawakhana. And I thought, these Hakims, these are the traditional people that, almost every society, Muslim, non-Muslim in Africa and Asia used to have. And they are disappearing. And so I remembered one of my senior cousins who had been trained in Hakim Ajmal Khan's, Dawakhana, and how he lived. And he sort of presented that very genteel tradition, which is sort of disappearing because of modernity. So you will see these articles in a very personal kind of context. But then I thought that Central Asia has opened very recently, and these countries have become independent republics. Of course, they have all kind of economic and political issues, but they have lots of rich history behind them. Whether you go to Uzbekistan, you go to Turkmenistan, you go to Kazakhstan or Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan or even Azerbaijan and these places. And I had been to some of these places, not to all of them, and I was fascinated by what I saw, the kindness of the people, the depth of the culture, and how these people who had been under the Russian system, then under the Soviet system, or reappropriating, their history, their culture. I grew up learning about Ibn Sina, reading about Al-Biruni, reading about Ali Sher Nawai, reading about Babur, and here I was in their land. And then I thought that these people are not only preserving their heritage, those madrasas, those seminaries, those buildings, not for touristic purposes, but to reconnect with their history. And so I wrote articles on Bukhara, I wrote 2 chapters on Samarkand. I lived in the Jewish area of Samarkand. And then I went to the Jewish cemetery because Samarkand and Bukhara used to have huge, Jewish communities for hundreds of years, Central Asia. And then I went to Isfahan, and I was fascinated by this city. This city is called Nisf Jahan, means half of the world. History, beautiful architecture, wonderful people. And then next door, Shiraz, the city of knowledge, like Oxford, like Cambridge, city of Sheikh Sadi, city of Sheikh Khaja Hafiz. And so I thought this is a kind of culture or literature and a kind of genteel tradition that perhaps we are disconnected with. And I thought maybe younger people, especially from amongst Muslims, should get to know, this background, because there's so much of negativity about Muslims and about their history, about their religion, about their politics, about their lifestyles, about their gender relationship, that some of us, some Muslims have started internalizing that. And I felt that perhaps here, historical knowledge could be empowering to our younger people, men and women. And they will see that despite all the human problems, poverty, political instability, and several conflicts, there are things which are celebrated and which are being maintained. For example, when I was in Uzbekistan, I was fascinated by Ulugh Beg. He is buried in the same tomb where, Timur, Tamerlane, his grandfather, is buried. I wanted to avoid Tamerlane, but you can't avoid Tamerlane because he is the godfather of Uzbekistan. He is the father figure, and he has replaced Stalin and Lenin and everybody else. But so I went into this beautiful mausoleum, and here is a man who was a philosopher king, who built a huge observatory. He built lots of seminaries. He used to live in those seminaries, and he used to give lectures. So I was fascinated by that person. And his mother, Gohar Shah, she opened schools, seminaries, orphanages for girls in Herat, because Herat later on becomes the capital of Timurid Empire. So same way, when I was visiting Isfahan, I visited some of those madrasas, and they're still, very, very active, and they have students living there. So, something that you see in Oxford and Cambridge, the people, the students, the teachers live on campus, and the interaction is, round the clock. And then I went to Fez, and I was fascinated. I didn't know that this is one of the oldest and intact, the most intact medieval city in the world. Once you get into Fez, there are no cars and scooters and lorries and all that. You think you are taken back to the medieval period. You see mules, you see shopkeepers, you see people talking to one another. You see these kavakhanes. You see one of the oldest universities in the world, which was established by 2 refugee women. I know Liz and Bill, my friends here in Oxford, they help refugees and people who come here seeking exile. But these 2 women, they came from somewhere else. And they established, Fatima al-Fahri established one of the oldest universities in the world, and still working, Al-Karawin. And it has lovely manuscripts which are being preserved, from early medieval period. So Fez really empowered me. And then I went to this little village near Rabat. I had read about Rabat and Saleh only in reference to the pirates. Oh, these pirates would come, they would attack Cornwall, they would attack Ireland, they would attack France, and they would kidnap people. So that was the idea of Saleh, just outside Rabat. But I was fascinated by the way, they are preserving the little village outside Rabat. And then I waited for this great academic, Fatima Marnisi, one early morning. I wanted to see her because I've been reading her books. She's considered to be the founder of Muslim feminism, but she was not keeping well. So my bad luck that I, couldn't see her. Same way I went to Konya because, from our childhood, we keep hearing about Maulana Rumi. And when you read Iqbal, especially in Farsi, Persian, Iqbal, who spent time in Heidelberg, and my friend Leyla Jagiella here is an academic who is based in Heidelberg. So Iqbal calls Masnavi, Maulavi, Manavi, Hast Quran dar Zubane Pahlavi. That after Quran, if there is any book of that caliber, it could be Masnavi, which is written in Farsi. And this is Maulana Rumi. And Rumi originally came from Balkh, which is in Afghanistan on the Silk Road. So I would tease my friends in Konya and around that, look, this is an Afghan who is buried here with all his 67, students and relatives. Because of the Mongol invasion, many of these families, Ashraf families, had to move out of Samarkand, Bukhara, and all across Merv. And, they ended up in India, in Iran, they ended up in Konya. So these are the places. But then I was a bit concerned that maybe I'm focusing too much on the Muslim world. The places where the Muslims are a majority, Lahore, Delhi, Central Asia, Iran, Turkey, North Africa. So I was lucky to go to Jerusalem. I stayed there and I traveled around. I spent lots of time in the old city. Yeah, it is a fascinating place. It's overpowering emotionally, and the history behind it. And but then I thought I should have something on Europe. And this is where the chapters on Switzerland, chapters on Finland, because in Finland, you have one of the earliest Muslim communities in Europe. These were Tatars, who came with the Russians as soldiers, and their descendants live in Helsinki and around Helsinki. So I was on a visiting fellowship at the University of Helsinki 3 or 4 times, and I would go and see my friends, Tatar friends, and sometimes pray with them, and they would recommend the restaurants, Turkish restaurants, and Iranian restaurants in Helsinki, and I'll go and meet them. And this was a wonderful experience of meeting one of the oldest Muslim communities in Europe, because when people talk about Muslims, they only talk about post-World War II migrations, and in the process, people also forget about Spain, about Sicily, about Portugal, and such places where Muslims were there in the medieval period. So there are short articles on Cordova and Sevilla, My whole idea was that, as I said, history-mindedness and just being on the road whenever I could find time between the semesters, and especially during summer, because this is the only time I could get away from my teaching or from the library. So I went to all these places. I haven't included anything on Southeast Asia, maybe in the next volume, Southeast Asia, East Asia. I've been to Africa, East Africa, Mauritius, Kenya. So maybe next time I'll try to explore those areas, and that could become part of another study. But as I was saying, my idea was that people should read something which is not a typical research volume. It should be an easy read. People could relate with it. People could give their opinion about it. People could be dismissive towards the author because there is so much of the author himself in all these essays. But at least it will make them feel that they are going through towns, like Bukhara, which was a city of Sufis. I mean, I think 70 mentors, Sufi mentors came from Bukhara. All these silsilas that we talk about, Leyla knows more about them than I do. Most of them, Naqshbandis, and they all came from Bukhara. Ibn Sina is considered to be the greatest Muslim philosopher or greatest medieval philosopher, was studied in Bukhara. He and Al-Biruni and Ibn Sina were contemporaries and friends. And they went to the same library in Bukhara, in the royal palace, Ark. And then Al-Biruni went east, and Ibn Sina went west to Hamadan. Al-Biruni went to India, 20 miles from the town where I was born. That's where he was based, in the Salt Rain. And he wrote his masterpiece, Kitab al-Hind, Indica. He learned Sanskrit. So all these stories sort of combine together, come together, and this is where all these chapters, take you to different regions, different people, different places. So that's the whole story behind this book. So there we go.
Thank you. I think if that's not a reason to buy the book, then I don't know what is. I mean, I think what I loved about the book was the way in which you really used the sort of, minutiae of detail in depicting the everyday lives of the people that you came across in such a way that it allowed us to really gain an insight into the lived realities of Muslims across a whole cross-section of communities and cultures. And I think that's a rare gift for a writer to use reportage in such an effective way. If I could invite the other panelists to come in now. Liz, perhaps you could sort of give us your responses to the book and what you enjoyed about it, and if you have any questions that you would like to propose to Iftikhar.
I'll put the questions at the end. I first of all say that it's been the most wonderful week of my life reading this book in many ways, because it's a challenging book. It takes you into the heart of things, and it's a very honest book, which is always a good thing, to have that connection between the reader and the person who's writing it. And the one thing that he always does is he reveals what he sees through his steady gaze, and he describes himself. He says, there I was, this lanky Southeast Asian, middle-aged, with a little bit of slightly curly hair on top. And I find that, I'm sure the other panelists feel the same, totally endearing, and it really makes you feel as if you're there. I think it's a great achievement. It takes us, its readers, across continents, from the cold of Finland and winding through alleyways in Samarkand and Fez, and it takes us, like painting with numbers, that when you give a child something which is apparently a blank piece of paper, and they're given a paintbrush, and as they paint, a whole set of things they didn't know were there suddenly come to light, and there's a story there. And he does that with the rich Islamic past, and Islamic entwined with Jewish, with other Abrahamic faiths, in a way which is uplifting. he also talks about the brutality of both the Islamic world, the history, and of course, the history of Christianity and its brutality. Some of the things, the stories that stick with me are a Colonel Hodgson, who after 1857, during 1857, says, I'm not a man who gets angry or anything, he says, but I have to admit, he says, that I had a certain satisfaction in ridding the earth of these wretches, meaning Muslims. And, you know, for me, as somebody brought up as a Christian but with a Jewish past, I read that, and someone whose ancestors were out in India, I read that with an absolute horror. So he also talks, when he goes to Rome, to Pisa, about the brutality, the current brutality of policemen, the casual racism that he encounters all the time, and of course, it's endemic to our society, which only makes me happy that we're doing this, that he's written this at a time when Black Lives Matter is happening. And I particularly liked when I was listening to Benjamin Zephaniah, who was giving a wonderful poem for Martin Luther King's Day just this week, which you can see on the World at One website if you just type in Benjamin Zephaniah. But I think this would be Iftikhar's dream as well, where Zephaniah says, yes, oh, we dream of a time when every white police officer in our land will be taught at schools that black civilizations were as good and as bad as white civilizations. And this civilization must abandon the cruel legacy of the evil white supremacy. The empire is dead, long dead the empire. I still dream of a time when angry white men and angry white women will unite and fight the system that oppresses us all. For we who stand together win together. We who dream together achieve together. I think that's enough from me. I have got a question. Okay, my question is, what about, you say, that you talk of a need for a new non-Western European-centric history of Southern Europe, and particularly of the Mediterranean, of that whole area. What would your advice be to young historians trying to write that not Eurocentric history?
Well, thank you very much for your comments and your impressions. Liz, this is a movement which has been going on for the last several years, and especially in more recent times, people want to enlarge humanities and liberal arts. I mean, whether it's philosophy or history or study of religion, or, you know, they feel that many regions in the world, like Africa, Native Americans, Aborigines in Australia, Indians, Persians, Chinese, Southeast Asians, they are not there. They're not visible. Absolutely. When we talk of world history, when we talk of world literature, everything comes back to Europe. I mean, we do understand that, you know, European languages, European countries, European history, in the last 400 or 500 years, this is the Europeanization of the world. And we live with it. But what we are trying to do is that we want to suggest that when you say, look, we're going to have a course on world philosophy. So where are the world philosophers outside Europe, strictly Europe, across the Mediterranean? So across the Mediterranean could be Asia, could be Africa, could be Latin America, and any other place. So I think in literature, in history, in humanities, in all these subjects, maybe in natural sciences as well, I think we need to have a reorientation. And also, I think in areas like arts, I remember in the 60s when there was a big exhibit in London on African art. First time, a big exhibit. Somebody told Picasso that there is an exhibit on African art in London. And Picasso said, African art? Never heard of it. So you could imagine this kind of ignorance. So we want to kind of decolonize scholarship, arts, literary debates, history. For example, until recently, you know, the medieval period was called Dark Ages, which is a very, very negative term. And even the word medieval was considered to be very negative and subversive. And some of the places that I visited, they were the centers of what we call early Renaissance, you know, like Bukhara, like Samarkand, like Faiz, Konya, all these places, you know, Shiraz, Isfahan, Delhi, Lahore, you know, they were the intellectual and cultural centers in those places. But they are not there when we write history. In history, sometimes classical history is celebrated, but then this classical period is all monopolized by the Greeks and the Romans. And then the medieval period is all right, not much known, not much celebrated, as if nothing happened, maybe a little bit about Mongols, a little bit about the Crusades, and then we move on to modern period with Columbus. And it appears as if entire human heritage, modern civilization, they begin with Columbus, they begin with the European. So this whole concept of periodization of history and then focusing only on Europe and from European perspective, this has not been very fair. And I think we need to enlarge it, and we need to get to know, you know, about other communities, about their societies, their dynamics. And this is where I thought that, you know, I made an effort to bring in Faiz, and I would like to bring in Alexandria because, you know, we hear a lot about Greek philosophy, but Alexandria was a major center of philosophy, you know, during the pre-Christian period. And same was the case with Syria. You know, some of the Syrian cities had these philosophers living there. Even Judaism and Christianity, later on Islam, they were defined in Syria. But you don't see those, you know, kind of narratives. Or ancient India, for example, Indus Valley civilization. Until 1930s, people thought India did not have any civilization. Maybe it was extension of Mesopotamian civilization. Same way, people don't know much about Central Asia or the Silk Road. I mean, people talk about Russia and now China, but what happened in these regions, and you know, how Chinese, Europeans, Asians, you know, they interacted. I mean, Mr. Machiavelli is sitting here. I can see him. How the Italians played such an important role. I mean, of course, we read about Alexander, and Alexander went to Samarkand and he thought it was the most beautiful city he ever visited. And then we have Italian ambassadors. We have Marco Polo, and you know, Polos are traveling across this road, and they're writing about these places. And then the Venetians are involved. They're competing with the Ottomans. And one reason that you know, the Europeans had to find an alternative route to Asia was because Constantinople and this whole region was captured by the Ottomans. So I think this entire history is very much interconnected, and there are big gaps, and that's what I'm concerned about. You know, like many other historians, that it is very episodic, very selective kind of history or humanities that we study.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz, for your comments, and thank you, Iftikhar. I mean, I think once again you illustrate how this book is so relevant to many of the topics and themes that concern us today. I'd like to now turn to Leyla Jagiella, as I mentioned, guest editor for the Relic's issue of Critical Muslim. Leyla, do you have any sort of responses after reading the book?
Well, first of all, I think I can repeat most of the praise that Liz has already mentioned about how it is written and how lovely and accessible it is and how exciting it actually is to go through these pages. I have to admit that I haven't yet had the time to complete reading the full book, unfortunately, but also a little bit fortunately for me, because there's still a lot that I can look forward to. I have sometimes a very idiosyncratic way of reading books, and I was reading through it basically until I think, well, maybe the half of it, but then I was getting a little bit impatient because I did see that Iftikhar had included a chapter on the Finnish Tatars at the end, and then I just skipped forward and I read the last portion before I continued with the first portion, and I have to say that this chapter in particular really delighted me. First of all, because I myself am very interested in Tatar histories in Eastern Europe, and I can only repeat what Iftikhar said, that this is a chapter of Islam, and in particular Islam in Europe, that is often ignored. We speak about Andalusia, we speak about Sicily, both marvelous civilizations, but we often forget that there is this centuries of history in Eastern Europe as well of Islam. And I've actually written an article on Islam in Poland in the Critical Muslim edition that you held up before, Samia. And so I was really delighted to see that chapter on Finnish Tatars, and I have to say this is probably the most dense writing that I've ever seen on this community. There's not much out there on this community at all. It doesn't feature much in our imagination of European Islam. I love that. I mean, the book is called The Silk Road and Beyond. So it's maybe not all about the Silk Road, but I loved how Iftikhar connected the idea of the Silk Road, which is often very much romanticized and historicized. You know, we think of these people like Marco Polo, but he connected this idea with very modern issues, and also with regions of the world that we do not immediately associate with the Silk Road, Switzerland being one of them. I don't think anybody thinks of Switzerland when we bring up the Silk Road, but it's very apt to speak about modern Switzerland in that context, because what our world and most certainly our Europe is today is a continuation of that history, and there's so much of that past entangled in everything that we do, actually, and what we owe so much to the Silk Road, and we all owe so much to Central Asia, not only as Muslims, when of course we all know, you know, Bukhari and his work, and other names have been mentioned already, Ibn Sina, Al-Biruni, and so on, but very simple things like apples come from Central Asia, for example. Whenever you eat an apple, you have Central Asian legacy in your hands and in your mouth that came into your life through the Silk Road. So we're all connected to this. And Iftikhar brings out a lot of this connectedness, and he always invokes the entanglement of histories, the entanglement of course, especially South Asian histories. He mentions how he grew up, if I remember correctly, close to the shrine of a Sufi called Pir Bukhari, who came from Bukhara to South Asia, and there's a lot of that history. We know that the Mughals actually were an extension of the Central Asian Timurids. On the other hand, the histories of Eastern European Tatars as well are connected to the empire of Timur and his ventures. Actually, the Tatar community in Poland were refugees who arrived in Poland in the Jagiellonian Empire because of the expansions of Timur. So through this, we have so many layers of connections between European history, Central Asian history, and South Asian history. And I really love that you can see that on almost every page of this lovely book. There's one thing that this brought to my mind, and it's something that I've wondered about a couple of times already, and maybe Iftikhar would like to comment on this, and that is that one thing that I find quite surprising is, well, as far as I know, and as far as my experience is with people from Central Asian countries that I know, there's a lot of interest in Central Asia nowadays, and a lot of love actually for South Asia and for South Asian culture. People have watched in Soviet times already. People have watched a lot of Bollywood movies. There's a lot of interest also in Urdu. And on the other hand, the interest of South Asians in modern day Central Asia is not very big. You know, of course, every South Asian Muslim knows about the history of the Mughals, and a lot of South Asian Muslims are proud of real or sometimes also imagined Central Asian ancestors. But there is not much interest in current modern day Central Asia, I feel, and also on the political level. We know there are economic interests why Pakistan would be more interested in China or Saudi Arabia or the Gulf or Iran and Turkey, but it really surprises me that there's so few political interests as well to strengthen and further this connection, which is so old. It's older than the Muslim history, actually. When we look at the pre-Muslim history, when we look at the Kushana Empire, for example, that also covered what is today Pakistan and Central Asia. So there's so much historical connection, but nowadays Central Asia does not seem to play much of a role in South Asian, neither South Asian politics nor popular imagination. So maybe Iftikhar could comment a bit on that.
Well, thank you very much, Leyla. A wonderful overview. I don't know. I mean, I think on the one hand, you're right that there's quite a bit of nostalgia, fascination, curiosity in South Asia about Central Asia, and same way in Central Asia about South Asia and West Asia. I think people-to-people contacts are still missing. You see business people or diplomats and, a few political leaders traveling, to and from. But I think there are a couple of reasons. One, I think sadly, Afghanistan, which remains unstable, has not been able to provide this land route between the subcontinent and Central Asia. Number two, most of the Central Asian countries are still focused on Russia, because their defense, their economies, their foreign policies, their educational systems, all those things historically are connected with Moscow. Just from Uzbekistan, there are 2 million to 2.5 million Uzbeks working in Russia, and they bring in, the foreign remittances like Indians, Pakistanis, and Afghans in the Gulf region. They are, but you're right that this ancient history has been ignored. And ancient history would include all different connections. For example, I don't know how many people in Central Asia or in South Asia know that Gandhara, the region that you mentioned, Takshashila, Sawat, Mardan, this was a connection with the Silk Road. And that is how Buddhism, went into China, before that went into Tibet. And that's why we got these monasteries and stupas and carvings all across Gilgit, Hunza, even all the way into Afghanistan. So Buddhism was a great connection between South Asia and Central Asia. And before that, I mean, if we talk about, I don't know, this is a contentious point academically and now ideologically, whether the Aryans, they came from Central Asia, regions near the Caspian Sea, went to Iran. Iran means land of Aryas, and they came to India. So Iran, Aryans and Sanskrit language, and then, the evolution of Brahmanism before it becomes Hinduism, especially in the Indus Valley. And that is what Rig Veda, the oldest Veda, is all about. So this is another connection, between Central Asia and South Asia. And then, of course, Zoroastrianism, which many people sadly don't know. This was a region, South Asia, parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Central Asia. They were Zoroastrian, for hundreds of years. I have a great respect for city of Urgench, which is the westernmost city in Uzbekistan. I went there. This is a city where Zarathustra was born. And they have developed a whole huge, beautiful park called Avesta Park. In the middle of the park, you have the sculpture of Avesta, the Holy Zoroastrian or Parsi book. In Pakistan and India, they're called Parsi because some of these people migrated during the Safavid period into India, and they were called Parsi, Persian. But originally, they are Zartushti, Zoroastrian. Multan, which is older than Lahore in Pakistan, had a huge Zoroastrian temple, all the way until 9th or 10th century. Same way, so in Urgench, I spent 2 days, and I went around, and I felt so, humble that this is a Muslim country, this is a Muslim city, not very rich, not prosperous at all, very neat, very clean, but very history-minded. They have developed a whole park, beautiful park, by the canal that they have brought from Mawar Nahar, Oxus River, and it is called Avesta Park. And then there is a Zoroastrian museum. So I've told some friends here who teach courses on Zoroastrianism or Pahlavi, the ancient language of Iran, that you should go and visit that place in Western Uzbekistan. And so Bukhara, for example, is a Vikhara in Sanskrit monastery. So I think there are these cultural, historical, lingual connections. 751 is a very important date. This is the time when the Arabs and Central Asians, after becoming Muslims, they had a battle with the Chinese in present-day Kazakhstan at a place called Talash. So 751, the Muslims defeated the Chinese, and they, got several Chinese prisoners. And those Chinese prisoners taught these Muslims how to make paper. And this is how paper was introduced in the rest of the world. Same way, gunpowder, tea, silk. So I think all these connections are very historical, and our knowledge is still very episodic. And now there's more interest on what the Chinese are doing and how these areas are becoming center of geopolitics. But
thank you, Iftikhar. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to bring in, we're very honored to have Dr. Osama Siddique joining us from Lahore in Pakistan. Dr. Siddique is a legal historian, and he writes historical fiction also. Dr. Siddique, would you like to offer your response to the book and your thoughts and any questions you might have for Iftikhar?
So thank you so much, and my apologies for being a bit late. I think I miscalculated, but it's a fascinating book at so many levels that I'll have to circumscribe what I say in terms of initial reactions. And I'm just hoping that can sort of perhaps in a small way contribute to the larger conversation. Let me first of all say that I was incredibly pleasantly, I wouldn't say surprised, but it was a pleasant revelation how much of an incurable romantic Professor Iftikhar H.Malik is. And what really sort of touched me, quite apart from his incredibly detailed and yet concise description, and my favorite part is the middle part of the book, which deals with all those medieval cities and all the intricate connections which he makes, which he's just referring to right now. But what was incredibly moving was how he felt when he went to those places and the various connections, and I think also processes of self-discovery, which I could see unfolding. I mean, I can imagine that there are lots of things he's already thought about deeply, but it almost appeared that, there's a lot more happening there. So one question which I'd have at a later stages, and I can feel that in Cordova, I can feel that in Fez, I can feel that in Uzbekistan. There's a lot of angst, and there's a lot of, I guess, frustration with how little we collectively know about this amazing cultural heritage, and not just from an Islamic standpoint, but from a global citizen standpoint, because we lose out on appreciating the richness of what this region has to offer. So I guess one area of inquiry for me is that when he actually visited those places, what happened which sort of further deepened the emotive side of things. And I think the other reason why I found this so very satisfying to read is that, in the milieu in which we live, and he refers to that, I have often wondered, and I'm sure a lot of people also wonder, that all these incredibly evocative names, from Isfahan to Baghdad, to Kandahar, to Herat, are essentially names now on a massive battlefield. Places incredibly dehumanized, places completely stripped off all the multifarious richness which Professor Malik talks about. And in that sense, I think it's an incredibly timely book for a lot of people in order to appreciate what is at stake. And as we hurl further into this century and into the senseless sort of contestations which are happening geopolitically, I think it's incredibly important to also appreciate the book from that standpoint. So there are so many other vistas as well. I'll just, for the moment, sort of flag these two things which particularly interested me. But it's a very rich audience here. I'm sure there's a lot more, and I really want to listen in.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siddique, for joining us, and sorry for this confusion about the time. Dr. Siddique is a man of diverse qualities. I've known him since the 1990s when he came to Oxford, and then to Harvard, and he's based in Lahore, and he's very active in literary circles. And I have his book here. This is his novel, very comprehensive, all the way from ancient Indus Valley. And this is the novel worth reading, and I'm sure he's working on something similar now, I mean, in his free time. But Dr. Siddique, you're right, that when we think about cities like Jerusalem or Iran as a country, or we think about Central Asia, you know, generally the focus is on conflicts, the focus is on negativity. And that's what I said initially in my early remarks, that I'm deeply worried, like you, that lots of Muslims are also internalizing this negativity. And they feel that we don't have anything like a heritage, cultural, intellectual, architectural, philosophical, to bank upon. So I felt that maybe this little bit of history, which is kind of very relaxed and you know, mostly in first person, would help these people understand where did Al-Biruni come from. He was like us, he had an ordinary background, but how did he become into one of the greatest philosophers of the medieval period? In the book he wrote about India, he studied Sanskrit, he spent 7 years with the Brahmins, he lived in the area. I know you have been to that place, Nandana, you have written about it, and he lived there. And he wrote this book, which is still a masterpiece in history and anthropology and study of religion of India, and especially of Hinduism. And he had great regards for this religion. And same with Ibn Sina. I mean, we're still looking for the books that Ibn Sina left. We know that he wrote 450 books, but we have only 250 books. So my feeling is that this is something which is ongoing. I was fascinated by a story, which actually I encountered when I was in Samarkand. I used to go to Bibi Khanum Mosque, which is an impressive mosque, which was built by Tamerlane. Some people think it was built by his wife. So behind the Ibn Khanum Mosque is a mohalla. It is called Multani Mahalla. And I was curious, how did this mahalla in Samarkand, because Tamerlane brought, you know, lots of people from India, and there were people from Multan, artists and soldiers, and they settled in that particular area of Samarkand. So even now, that mohalla, that area, called Multani Mahalla, and some of the gypsies that I saw in Uzbekistan and especially in Samarkand, they're also called Multani. So, I mean, this is a kind of ongoing connection. And Leyla mentioned Imam Bukhari. I mean, Imam Bukhari, of course, who gathered the hadith, and his student, Imam Muslim, you know, was from Nishapur. And Nishapur, not very far from Central Asia, and city of knowledge, city of learning. And Fariduddin Attar was from Nishapur. Imam Ghazali was from Nishapur, one of the great philosophers, especially in Sunni traditions. My own street, where I was born, is called Imam Bukhari Mahalla. So I don't know which Bukhari came to that part of, you know, the subcontinent, which is now in Pakistan. But about 20 miles from my birthplace is a beautiful lake. It's called Kalar Kahar. And from very childhood, I remember, you know, from my early childhood, we used to go there for picnic. And there was a big rock, and it was called Takhte Baburi. Babur's throne, and it's mentioned in Babur's autobiography in Turkish called Tuzke Baburi. And lots of people now visit it. So Babur actually stayed in that area, the founder of the Mughal Empire. So there's lots of this information which connects, these regions, and which I thought is worth exploring. In Konya, for example, the connection that Maulana Rum built with this part of Silk Road, because Silk Road traditionally ended near Konya, somewhere in Aleppo, which is now in Syria. Sadly, the city destroyed because of the civil and regional war. But Maulana Rum and his followers, they came, and this was where the Seljuki sultans had, established themselves. So I think there are all these kind of connections which we need to learn about, and which we also need to celebrate. And this is where I think, Dr. Siddique, your point is very valid, that we have to go back to this history in terms of, not just awareness, but also for the sake of empowerment, and to have some kind of positive attitudes towards this heritage that we share across the countries and across the centuries.
Can I make just one more sort of follow-up point? So the other sort of interesting thing which struck me is how narrowly identity is currently being defined in a lot of places in the world. And India and Pakistan, of course, are a particular, a fairly obvious example with Hindutva in India. But I think, and of course, this notion of a very sort of Salafi self-identity in Pakistan to a certain extent. And what's particular about that identity is also that it's incredibly exclusionary. It's very, very sort of parochial. It's not very pluralist. And quite apart from the sheer wonder of sort of discovering this incredibly proximate history, which was also a very turbulent history, I think what also comes across is how there are no sort of airtight boundaries between knowledge. You read about these men and women of knowledge, and it turns out that they sort of really, their interests encompass so many disciplines, but it's also the stories of tolerance which you tell. So not only are there stories of marauders in these centuries, there are also stories and islands and epochs of great plurality. And I think now, as a South Asian, I've always taken an immense amount of pride, hopefully pride without any negative connotations to it, to the fact that our sort of culture is so rich, right? So from Sanskrit to Turkish to Arabic to Persian, so many influences define the language and the culture. And to the extent that one gets more familiar through your book with these neighborhoods and these sort of civilizations, it's a very pluralist identity which comes through. It's not just a single Uzbek identity. Everything is so interconnected and mixed. And so Babur, the emperor and the poet and the writer may be influenced by multiple influences, and Imam Bukhari's influences comes all the way to South Asia, and the Gandhara meets up with the Bactrian, so there's so much going on. So from a purely curricular standpoint, even as an educationist, I feel that there is a real paucity of these books. So we either have scores of books which is talking about descent into chaos, the grand implosion, all kinds of doomsday titles associated with the Muslim world. Or we have things which are talking in a very sort of here and now kind of a context, and not really contextualizing the larger civilizational trends. And it's not as if modern day Pakistan does not have that ethnic diversity or that linguistic diversity. And if you are to survive even as a federation, it's important to be able to embrace that. So I think it's at multiple levels that the book plays an important role in terms of stirring up an important discourse, a discourse which is the need of the times, I feel.
I think you're very right, because when I went to Jerusalem, I didn't realize that it had a very historic connection with the Indus Valley, because I discovered a hospice in the old city of Jerusalem, which is called Indian Hospice, and it was visited in the 13th century by Baba Farid. Now, Baba Farid is one of the earliest Punjabi poets, and he was a Sufi, and he lived in Punjab, and he was the Sufi master, and his poetry is found in Guru Granth Sahib, the sixth holy book. And that's how we know that, 800-900 years ago, Baba Farid, wrote Punjabi poetry, Sufi poetry. And he went to Jerusalem. I think this is soon after Saladin had defeated Richard the Lionheart. And Richard the Lionheart, by the way, was born here in Oxford and Beaumont Street. So Baba Farid goes all the way. I think maybe he went on Hajj. And then from there, many Muslims would go to Jerusalem as well. So he did his Jilla, his 40-day meditation. And that is where that hospice is located. And it's very active. There is an Indo-Palestinian family which looks after this hospice. So you find all these kind of connections. And recently I've been reading a manuscript of a Balachi scholar who was visiting India and Sri Lanka and Burma in the late 16th century. And he came back to Balkh, and then he lived in Bukhara, and he wrote about it. But we don't know about these visitors, these travelers. I mean, Babur's daughter, Gulbadan Begum, she spent 5 years in Hijaz, which is called Saudi Arabia today. And she went on Hajj, and she was delayed, and then she wrote this beautiful book, Humayun Nameh, which is about her father and her brother, Humayun, the second emperor. So there are lots of these kind of stories and travelogues that we are not really, aware of. And you're very right that our knowledge is very, very episodic, and there are these, sort of lost gaps. And this is where, we need to make efforts to fill up those gaps. But it's an area where we need lots of written work, we need lots of travel, we need to do some kind of collaborative work. I know people in Central Asia, they mostly use Russian, but now they're coming back to English, and also they're coming back to Farsi, because this is what Marshall Hyson, the great American historian, used to call Persianate. And more recently, late Professor Shahab Ahmed of Harvard University used the word, from Bosnia to Bengal paradigm. So there was kind of lingual, and cultural sort of commonality, but within that commonality, there was quite a bit of diversity, whether it was doctrinal or ethnic. Like when I was in Kenya, I taught there for a month. I went to Mombasa, and I discovered a street called Balochi Street, because there were Balochi soldiers in the 17th century fighting against the Portuguese in Zanzibar and in Mombasa. So there is a street named after Balochi people, from Balochistan. So there are all these kind of connections. I think you're right that we need to learn more about them to make the world a bit more tolerant towards one another, towards diversity.
If I may, Samia, can I add something?
Yes, I was going to ask Leyla or Liz if they wanted to contribute. Please go ahead, Leyla.
No, I was just thinking of this now that Iftikhar mentioned the Indian hospice in Jerusalem, that I always find it very interesting to look at the fact that this age of, we could call it an age of traveling, an age of exploration, how far it extended into the modern age actually as well. And it was, especially for Muslims, it was part also of their spiritual development. For scholars, it was actually important to travel. You had to travel as a scholar. If you only stayed in your town and you acquired knowledge there, you were not taken seriously, actually. There was this idea that as a scholar, you should go on your rihla, you should go on that journey to seek knowledge, as the hadith of the Prophet said, seek knowledge, and even if you have to go as far as China. And that was practiced until very recently, actually. I've come, well, one example comparable to the hospice in Jerusalem is that in Istanbul, there's a tekke, derga, a Sufi, what do you call it? Not a monastery, but a place where Sufis gather, which is called the Özbekler tekke. So it's the tekke of the Uzbeks, of the Central Asians who came there for centuries until the early 20th century, actually. And in the early 20th century, the tekke became an important place of nationalist Turkish activity, actually. On the other hand, I've recently come across stories of Tatars from Russia Tatar scholars who used to go to Peshawar to study Islam, and then often continued and they studied in Aligarh or in Deoband, for example. And this happened just in the 19th century. This is not long ago, that for Muslims it was so normal to travel all across the world in search of knowledge. Not only for Muslims, of course. And then in the 20th century, all these border regimes were invented. And we now think of these border regimes as something natural. We think it has always been like that, but it hasn't. Of course, they're always, empires always had interest in controlling the movement of produce. There were some kinds of control sometimes at borders, but it never was the way it is in the 20th and 21st century. And this is a complete novelty. It's not natural to human beings, and Liz from her work knows very well how much pain and how much suffering these kind of border regimes produce. And I've been working in the refugee help sector as well, and I can tell you a lot of stories about that as well. These are inventions that are only with us for a few decades now, but we all don't question them. We all think this is how the world is organized, how states organize things, how also Muslim nations organize things. But it has never been this way. There has been much more movement across nations, much more traveling, and also much more of an ideological belief, if you could say so, in traveling and in crossing borders, actually.
Thank you, Leyla. Liz, if you want to add anything.
Yes, I'd love to, please. Hang on. Yes, I would love to. Just two things. One thing that we haven't brought out, which is very richly there in Iftikhar's work, is he takes us through a journey about how things have changed in the US, particularly, and also in what was Soviet areas. How the intensity of racism has changed during that time. And I would like him to expand on that, because I think it's a terribly important thing, because if things can change over 40 years, quite dramatically in some cases, then they can change again for the better, the things that are so bad. But I had a particular question for both Iftikhar and actually for the other panelists, which is, if we're trying to popularize, if we're trying to get people to really understand, as many people as possible from amongst the diaspora of the world, of the Muslim world, but also amongst just ordinary populations, so we have much more knowledge of what the real, you talk about the dark ages that certainly weren't the dark ages. They were the illuminated ages of the Islamic world, the fantastic Renaissance in the golden years of the Islamic world. But how do we get that across? Do we have as many television programs as we can with popularizers, such as the ones we're certainly seeing in both the US and the UK at the moment? Is that enough? Do we have historical novels? Here's my question to Osama particularly, but also Iftikhar, who mentions it in the book. Or are there other ways we can, inventive ways to get this history, this rich heritage, which is our present? As a historian, I would say we are nothing without our histories. How do we get that across? So there you are. That's my thought.
I think these are very valid questions, and I would like Dr. Siddique to come back to it, because he has authored such an impressive novel, bringing South Asian history together over and above all these divisions that worry us all. I was fascinated by this city. I mean, of course, we talk about Muslim Spain and Jews, Christian, Muslims living together. And Cordova is one of my favorite towns, not simply because of the mosque, and it's very impressive, but largely because two great scholars, amongst many others, two most preeminent scholars, they both were friends and contemporaries, came from Cordova, and they shared lots of history. Maimonides, the famous Jewish classicist, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd. And they both were neighbors. They were born in Cordova. Then we see them in Fez. They were teaching at this university, Cairo. And then Maimonides goes to Egypt. He was actually planning to go to India because his brother had already traveled to India. And then he becomes the physician of Saladin. So he writes in Arabic. And I read correspondence to him from Yemen and Morocco, the Jewish people saying to him, why don't you write in Hebrew? Why are you writing in Arabic? He said, because I want all kinds of people to read me. And Arabic was the lingua franca of the Mediterranean region at that time. Same way when you talk about Thessaloniki, you know, the city, Salonika or Salonika, where Kemal Atatürk was born. I was always fascinated by this city. Here was a city where Jews were in majority. Can you imagine in the last 2,000 years, one city where Jews were in majority? Because many of them were rescued by the Ottomans from Spain during Inquisition. So they came to Salonika, which is now called Thessaloniki. And then there's a tragic history. Muslims, Jews, and Christians were living together. But as Dr. Siddique mentioned and was mentioned by Leyla, this whole idea of territorial state, nation state, you know, came into being largely on the basis of a very exclusive nationalist ethos, which became very ethnic and, as Liz is saying, became racialized. So cities like Cordova, cities like Toledo, cities like you know, Thessaloniki, they became monocultural and to a great extent monoethnic. And this is where ethnic cleansing happened in the name of, you know, nation state. So I don't know, maybe Dr. Siddique will be in a better position to suggest a kind of way out to create awareness, whether it's through historical fiction, or is it by writing popular history, or is it by using social and visual media to create interest on parallel lines against this exclusivity that we see all over the world.
I think, sorry, before Dr. Osama jumps in here, if you could make your comments, and then I would like to bring in questions from other participants to the panel, if that's okay. So go ahead, and then we'll get questions from the audience.
Sure. So I think that's a very valid question, and I think as academics, it is perhaps something which we can relate to, that we can get lost in our own internal discourses, which are fairly intelligible to us, not realizing that for various reasons, you know, they're not necessarily very accessible to a lot of people. And therefore, I think there's always this value for popular history. But I think quite apart from popular history, I think historical fiction does play a huge role. I think it's the evocativeness of fiction which has a very sort of important sort of imprint on our minds, especially if you get exposed to it early. It definitely did so in my case. And I was quite thrilled when I saw in The Silk Road and Beyond, Dr. Malik mention a popular historian who's not very popular these days, and I'll tell you why. And his name is Naseem Hijazi. And this is a Pakistani historian we all grew up reading. And he was not a rigorous historian by any stretch of imagination, but he had a very good grasp of the larger events. And yes, he did romanticize things, and yes, but he gave you a great sense of the span of this entire region. And the kind of thing which Dr. Malik does, of course, much more rigorously and much more. But I tell you, those books still have and I must say, I was recently thinking about him before I came across his name, because there are a lot of people now who are very cynical about this valorization or any triumphalism or any over-romanticization of the past. You know, there's a lot of cynicism about that as well. Every society, every culture does grow up with certain notions of heroes and heroines. You know, it's important. It's important to valorize a brave soldier or a great scholar and to create those characters. You can't start talking about deconstruction to a 14-year-old, you know, or a critical assessment of history. You need that romance. As you grow up, hopefully you become more nuanced, but you still want to retain a bit of that. You don't want to become a complete cynic. So the other thing which he mentions, of course, is the great poet Iqbal and his poem called Masjid-e-Qartaba, which is about Cordova. I think that's the single most evocative poem in Urdu poetry when it comes to people thinking about Spain in South Asia. So it's remarkable how a single poem or a single historical novel written for young adults can have a huge bearing. Now, in a way, this kind of popular history is re-emerging through popular media, whatever we might say, which is a different conversation. For example, take the popular Turkish serial Ertuğrul. Now, Ertuğrul, we can discuss ad nauseum at several levels. I think it's a fascinating phenomenon. At a very basic level, I must confess that I enjoyed it tremendously. But I was not learning my history from it. It broadly got the centuries and the powers right. But the very fact that people are getting exposed to Ibn al-Arabi, finding out about the Crusades, about the Mongols, about the Ayyubids and the Seljuks, that in itself is a big thing. All the way from South America to East Asia. Now, there is a politics behind it. There are other issues. But I think that's a very good example of how something historical so many centuries ago has become an international phenomenon. To that extent, I think that proves that point about how much value it has to popularize additional discourses and interest in history.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions from other participants? How are we going to do this? If you want to make yourself heard. Brandino? I think Brandino has a question. I wonder if Zia has a question. So Brandino, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you. We can hear you.
Great. Thanks. Hi, how are you all? My question to Iftikhar is, what is your take on what's happening today in the Silk Road with China and Europe and all these connections which are being planned? I mean, how does that connect, if any, if at all, with all the old countries which are used to be under Russia and are now sort of emerging a little bit on their own? Well, do you have anything on that in the book, for instance, or?
Well,
not?
Thank you very much, Mr. Machiavelli, and thanks for joining from Italy, and historic family and wonderful friend. We always meet in Salisbury. Hopefully Salisbury Winter Gathering will happen this year, despite all the hazards. I think there is, I mean, I don't write about it because I'm mostly writing about history and culture and all that. I don't get too much into politics in these chapters. Some chapters may look a bit more political, but generally I'm talking about history and and art and a little bit of literature and architecture and my own travel and my own encounters with ordinary people. My feeling is that these countries are lodged between two powerful countries, Russia on one side and China on the other side. And both these countries, consciously or unconsciously, are competing to gain political, geopolitical, and economic interests. So these countries have to be very careful. Number two, they want to benefit from both Russia, because with Russia they have historic relationship. Their medium of instruction is Russian. They speak Russian with one another. Even if they write their own languages, Uzbek or whatever, they are in Cyrillic, Russian script. But they also want Chinese investments. They also are a big market for Chinese goods. And I'm sure China is looking forward to reach other regions through Central Asia. And Chinese want to sell their weapons as well. So there is a kind of new great game, as the British and the Russians used to call it. There's a new great game happening between Russia and China in all these states. Second concern is that they don't want to be a battleground between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because they're mostly, sort of Sunni people. There are Shia communities, there are Ismaili communities in Tajikistan, but they don't want Iran and Saudi Arabia to make them into a battleground for Shia Sunni. So they're very careful. So lots of people go on Hajj, some people go to Karbala, but mostly, the governments, because the governments are basically authoritarian, one party or one personality government. So they are very much authoritarian. So I talk to intellectuals privately, and they open up. They say, look, Iftikhar, we have to, abdicate some of our political rights to have peace, to have stability. So in the name of peace, in the name of stability, they're not coming out on the streets. And another, I think, area that worth looking is that they want to have economic development because they are very much resource deficient. Their water resources are drying up, their populations are young, they're looking for jobs, whether it's in Dubai or in Moscow or anywhere else. They want to diversify their educational system. So there are lots of challenges. But one thing which I found fascinating about these regions, about these countries, is that they are reappropriating their heritage. And this is where Farabi becomes the philosopher of Kazakhstan. This is where Babur becomes the father figure after Tamerlane in Uzbekistan. Where an Afghan, Ali Sher Nawai from Herat, becomes the greatest poet of all these Turkic people because he is the first person to write in Çuhtay Turkish. So appropriation of their culture. Another fascinating thing about this region is, maybe you could give credit to the Soviet system, is that women are highly literate and very visible in all these 6 or 7 countries, which really is fascinating. And the law is very strong. I didn't see much of sexism on street. I didn't see people whistling or saying stupid things to women. Women can wear skirt, women can wear veil, women can wear chadar, whatever. But the empowerment of women in these republics is an impressive achievement. So these are some of the things which these people want to maintain, but they know that they are, faced with this great game. They have very good relationship with South Korea because South Korea and Japan appear to be non-political, but they can develop the economies in Uzbekistan, in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan. But they're also trying to get more and more tourists because they feel that their histories should be acknowledged, plus more money will come in. But there are lots of young people, who are trying to become translators, who are trying to become guides. Their universities are very good, very well organized. I mean, you got to give credit to the Soviets that they have built up the infrastructure, which has helped these regions. So there are some minuses, but there are some plus points as well. But I think their greatest challenge in geopolitical sense is how China and Russia are going to relate with each other and relate with these people on the Silk Road.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I say something? Samia, do you mind? Very, very quickly. So the people that you talk to in these countries, they didn't see the Silk Road. I mean, obviously, did they know? I suppose they knew about the Silk Road historically, but they didn't see the new Silk Road just as a train full of goods passing through their country, going from China to Istanbul or something like that, or Germany.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, to them, it's more than that. I think this is where they bring in, their scholars, their histories, their architecture, so that the people should see them, the outsiders should see Central Asia in a more holistic way. I think Uzbekistan is ahead of all the other states because it's the most populous, and then it's lucky to have cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, and then Tashkent was the capital of entire Central Asia under the Russians and then under the Soviets. So they have a very well-developed infrastructure. They are very tolerant towards diversity, which is where Zoroaster Park in Urgench fascinated me. Turkmenistan is a bit more authoritarian, and I think Kazakhstan has interesting relationship with Russia because it's still in Kazakhstan 10 to 15% population, they are Russian. From many other states, many Russians have gone back to Russia. So there are these migrations, but my worry is that there is no regional cooperation. So things could explode, like in the Middle East, like in South Asia. So they need something like European Union or something like ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Central Asia, because their railway systems, their water systems, their borders, their ethnicities, they're all divided. So they have to develop a sense of regional cooperation before they follow South Asia or the Middle East, which will be very sad, lots of conflicts.
Thank you. Iftikhar, do we have any other questions? Iqbal Asaria, sorry if I'm missing anyone else. Good to see you, Iqbal. Do you have a question for Iftikhar?
Yeah. Iftikhar Bhai, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you have given some thought to, the Chinese policy in Xinjiang at the moment. Now, I would think that from the historic Silk Road route and the new Belt and Road Initiative, Xinjiang and Kazakhstan would be quite central to the whole project. Now, to alienate Xinjiang in this way, could you see any particular reasoning for China to do that?
I think it's a very valid question, and it deals with human rights. I'm sure Liz and everybody else here would be deeply concerned with what's happening in Xinjiang. The local people don't use the term Xinjiang, they call it Eastern Turkestan. So I think you're right. The Chinese policies there are based on sinification, something that they have been doing in Tibet. So in Xinjiang or in Eastern Turkestan, sadly, we see, Tibet, history of Tibet being repeated. The problem is that all the Istans, including Pakistan, keep quiet because first they have developed a very close economic and trade relationship with Beijing, and they don't want to annoy China. Even, the Turkish president, who was earlier very vocal, and there were some people from Xinjiang migrating into Turkey via Thailand. So I think Chinese, maybe some people think that we should keep China engaged with all these Muslim countries in Central Asia, with Pakistan, with Iran, with Turkey, and perhaps we could moderate the Chinese. But you're right. I mean, these are big issues. This is the biggest province of China. It was annexed. Itself was colonized. So the concern is that the Chinese are centralizing this region, and the demographic changes are happening. More and more people of Han ethnicity are settling down in Xinjiang, and economic integration. Maybe this economic integration with Kyrgyzstan, with Kazakhstan, with Tajikistan and Pakistan, maybe that will ensure the preservation of the faith and the culture of people in Turkestan. So things could go both ways. They could be totally, integrated, or they could become totally marginalized, or they could get some kind of strength in developing relationship because of this initiative, with the Uzbeks and with the Pakistanis and with other, neighbors in. I think it's a big issue for China as well. It's a big issue, how to handle the issue of Xinjiang. I think they would have to think about alternative ways to win over the confidence of the people. They can't go on creating another Tibet in the Western regions. Tibet is totally isolated. Xinjiang is not. Xinjiang, historically, ethnically, and religiously connected with these 5, 6 other powerful countries in the neighborhood.
Thank you, Iftikhar. I wonder if anyone else has any other questions to put to the panelists. I can see Zia in attendance. Zia, do you have any questions?
Is Zia there?
Zia is here.
No, I've been listening quietly. I think I'm happy to listen to this very rich discussion. I'm sorry I was a bit late, so I missed the opening of the presentation, but I managed to follow the discussion. Incredibly rich discussion.
Thank you very much, Zia.
Abraham has a question. Where is Abraham?
You see me? Hello?
Sorry, apologies. There are so many faces. Please go ahead.
Hi, Prakash. Pleasure to hear you after such a long time. I apologize, I missed the opening bit, but I want you to talk a bit about, if you can, Christian-Muslim relations. Of course, the Silk Road, your book says that you talk about the lived realities of the land. What do you think are the prospects for moving forward of Christian relations within the like Turkey, where of course there's a huge, of course, a very Christian.
I think the connection is not too great there.
If I'm not wrong, I think what Abraham Murad is saying from Lahore is that do we see more tolerance? Do we see more celebration of plural history of the past? I think that will come with knowledge, that will come with mobility, that will come with travel. For example, how some of the earliest Jewish synagogues and Jewish communities and Christian communities and then Buddhist and Hindu and Zoroastrian communities were established across the Silk Road regions. I think this is something that we have to learn and we have to include in our textbooks, and how we see Nestorians, going all the way to China. The Christians in early Islamic literature are called Nasrani because they're from Najran. And so these people travel across the Silk Road, and that's how Christianity is introduced into this region. So I think what I gather from Abraham's point is that perhaps diversity and historicity and plurality of the Silk Road has pertinent lessons for today's politics, which is becoming very populist and which is becoming very centrist and uniformist with great amount of intolerance built into it.
I'm mindful of the fact that we're coming up to 6:30. Do the panelists want to make some sort of closing comments, and then I'll ask Iftikhar to say some final words. Liz, do you have anything? No? Dr. Osama?
No, I think not for the moment, no.
Okay, Leyla, is there anything you'd like to ask? Okay, well, I would just like to thank all of you. I hope I haven't missed anybody else's question, but many thanks to all of you for attending. I think you'll agree this was an extremely rich and constructive and illuminating discussion. And I'm absolutely so thrilled that we were able to celebrate your book today. So please go out and buy it. Do hold up the book again so everyone can identify it at their local bookshop. And please
Sama's book.
Yes.
Samia.
Yes, Brandino.
Can you tell me where I can buy the book, because Amazon doesn't have it yet?
It doesn't.
Should be available soon. They say mid-September, so it should be available soon, hopefully. I think it's available in Pakistan and India, but it should be available here as well.
I ordered it about a month ago.
I was asked, I don't know how many. I was asked once how many, whatever is the Pakistani money, something like 15,000 of it to get the book.
No.
Then I discovered it was coming from Pakistan, so I gave up.
1,500 rupees, but you are a publisher. Maybe you should bring out an edition here in Europe, in Italy.
Yeah, I mean,
but it should be available on Amazon pretty soon. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll let you know when it is available.
Okay.
But my thanks to all of you, my thanks to Muslim Institute, to Samia for organizing it, and my special thanks to my honorable panelists, colleagues, to Osama, to Liz, to Leyla, and to the participants for your kind patience. Thank you very much.
And I'd like to echo that. Thank you so much, everybody. And
thank you so much.
Thanks again for our next webinar.